In this video, we're going to be learning the basics of the Python programming language, as well as how to think like a programmer, specifically using the Python language. The purpose of this video is teach you the basics of Python so that you can get started with the language and sort of understand how the language works at a higher level, as well as the basic building blocks and concepts of Python. And we're actually going to be coding a basic program using these basic building blocks to show you just how much you can actually get done just with the basics. And lastly, at the end, I will direct you to the courses and resources that I recommend for you to keep going with Python if you decide that this is a language that you want to master. There will be both free options and the paid options if you're willing to invest a bit of money into your learning. But before all that, let's briefly discuss why Python is such a great language for you to get started learning to code. Firstly, it's the applications. Python has sort of emerged as one of the most popular languages in the industry, and there's a humongous amount of demand for Python developers at the moment. But whether Python is for you will actually depend on what sort of programming you're most interested in. I know I've said before that the best language for beginners learning to code is actually JavaScript, and that still applies for a lot of people. And the reason for that is that JavaScript is best for web development, but for a lot of other things, like for example data science, artificial intelligence, are super in right now. And personally for me, these areas are what interests me the most actually, because Python is the most popular language in these applications, has actually pushed myself to switch from focusing on JavaScript to actually focusing on Python. The second reason is the syntax. Python is an extremely user-friendly language. The syntax is extremely easy and it's really easy to understand, and because of that, very easy to learn as well. And the third reason are all the libraries and the support that exists for Python. Essentially, anything that you can probably think about doing in a programming language, there's probably a library that someone else has written that you can essentially just import, use the functions and objects that someone else has already made so that you don't have to do everything from scratch. There's just so much potential with Python and you can do so many cool things with it. That's why I've started using Python in a lot of my personal programs that I'm writing for myself, like a lot of my automation projects, like in this video right here. But yeah, you can just do so much with Python. That's why it's such an exciting language to start with. And obviously, lastly, as I sort of touched on already, the job demand. Python is one of the most in-demand languages in the world. So probably for a lot of people, the thing you care about the most is getting your first job. So if you know Python, there you go. It's one of the best languages for that because so many companies need Python skills. So now, as promised, let's get into the tutorial part of this video where I teach you the basics of Python so that you can get started with this wonderful language. I believe that the best way to learn is by actually applying concepts immediately into something tangible and fun. So if you follow along and build this program with me, I guarantee you'll learn a lot. Now, normally code is written in something called a code text editor, or just IDE, which is basically just like Microsoft Word except for coding. Normally you have to install all these text editors in this program, and you have to install Python on your computer as well for you even to be able to run it. But for what we'll be doing in this video, you don't have to do any of that, because actually what we'll be writing our code in is this browser-based IDE called Replit. We're also very kindly sponsoring this video. Replit is a popular free online platform that allows you to start coding without having to set up anything, and they provide a social browser-based IDE to build and host your project, as well as collaborate with others and share your work. I honestly think that this tool is absolutely brilliant for beginners, and I use it all the time from even my own stuff if I don't want to go through the hassle of like creating folders and like setting up my environment and that kind of stuff. So if you go down to the link in the description, you'll be able to create an account with Replit and create a REPL, which will allow you to code along with me throughout this video. For this, it's absolutely fine to start with a free plan. They also have this premium hacker plan, which has a lot more cool features. But for now, just go create the account and let's start coding. Okay, so we're gonna get started by creating a REPL right here. We're gonna choose Python as the language, and I'm just gonna name it tutorial. Essentially what you see here is on the left hand side here is the area where you write your code, and on the right hand side on the console is where you will actually see the output what you're coding, and we'll see in a second what that actually means. So if this is your first time writing Python, that's absolutely fine. We're gonna learn how to print hello world. You're gonna write print parentheses and the quotation mark hello world, and you're gonna click run up here, which is gonna run your program, and there you go. You've written your first ever Python program. Congratulations. So what's actually going on here is we're calling this function, which is called print, which is a function that is built into the Python programming language. So the creators of Python have created this function, have defined this function called print. This time we're passing a text string. It just prints it, so outputs it into the console. The most basic function in the world, but a really nice one to get started with. Later on, we'll learn how to actually define our own functions rather than just using built-in ones like this. We're going to try this again. Instead of printing hello world, we're actually going to print a number, and then it's going to print 5. As you can see right here, when you're printing text in Python and in most programming languages, what you have to do is use these quotation marks to essentially tell Python that we want to use a text string. You can use double quotes or single quotes, doesn't really matter. I think there's some minor differences, but basically it's the same thing. But with numbers, you don't need to use quotation marks. You can, but if you use quotation marks with numbers, the Python language is actually going to interpret the number as a text string. And this difference between strings and numbers is an example of data types in a programming language. A number in Python is commonly referred to as an integer. And you can see that if you type int, it actually shows all these things, which it actually highlights it. Replit here is recognizing that int in Python is this sort of special word. Another one is string, which is abbreviated using just str. But with these ints, so numbers, you can actually do math, just like you would expect with numbers. You can print not only just 5, you can print 5 plus 6, for example, and what it's going to output 11. Then you can do anything else you might imagine, and boom, I get 22. So integers and strings are treated differently in Python. They're different data types. They take a different amount of space in the memory, which again, details which you don't need to worry about right now. But essentially the first thing we need to realize about a programming language are these different data types, and there's a lot more. There's, for example, float, whereas an int is just, well, it's an integer. It's a single number without any decimal places. If you write 10.6, for example, the type of this 10.6 is not int, it's float. And you can also do arithmetic with floating point numbers. 2.5 plus 7.8, and it's gonna output 10.3, as it should. There's a bunch of other data types. For example, we have Boolean, which is essentially just true or false. So we've talked about data types, we talk about functions. What about if you need to use the same, either a number or a text string in multiple places? What you can do is store the strings or ints or whatever data types into variables, which sort of stores it in a place of memory for you to access later. You have a calculation right here. Let's say this is a really important calculation. Rather than having to type 2 times 5 plus 6 and multiple times, where you can store this in a variable, and we can do that by first writing just a name, whatever name we want to give to it. So let's say calculation will be the name of our variable, equal sign, and then whatever you want to store into this variable. Now, whenever you type calculation, it's going to go look for this value from the computer's memory. So if you go print calculation and we run it, it's going to print 22, which is the same as right here. So this way, you can actually start storing these values into variables to access them later. And then you can do other stuff. You can go print calculation times 3, for example, and it's going to return 66. And I know that at this point, you're probably feeling like this is a bit useless, like where's the point of all of these things? I promise you in a moment, we're going to start coding an actual program with all of these things. Now we can store things in variables, but let's say you have a lot of different numbers that are related to each other. Let's say you want to remember the ages of all your best friends, and you need this information later. So you create a variable age1 equals 22. So this is the age of your friend number 1. And the other friend is 35. So you will create a second variable age2, which is 35, and age3, which is, let's say, 43, something like that. That's actually an easier way for you to store these kinds of related values that are related to the same thing that you want to sort of keep grouped together than just creating different variables for them. What you can do is use Python's built-in lists. The way you do this is you create one variable which is going to store all of the ages that you want to store. So for example, we can call this ages and then equal, and then we're going to do something magical. We're going to click curly brace and 22, comma, 35, comma, 43. And now we've stored all these ages in this one ages variable rather than having separate variables for all of them. You can see how this is a lot simpler to write and it makes a lot more sense as well. So the way you access these individual items of a list in Python is using this kind of syntax. You go ages, curly brace, and then the index of the item that you want to access. And one thing you want to remember, which is probably going to trip you on in the beginning, is that in Python and in most programming languages, indexing starts from 0. So this 22 is actually index 0. So you would access this by writing ages, curly braces, 0, and we get 22. If you want to access 35, we would go ages 1. Even though it is the second item on the list, you access it using the 1 index. That's just how it works. This is index 0, this is index 1. For whatever reason, that's how the creators of Python have decided to index. So you just need to keep that in mind, and it will become second nature very quickly. Okay, so my camera actually ran out of battery. So for that reason, I'm filming the second part of this tutorial actually in a different day. You might even see that I've got a fresh trim just for you. But let's get into actually making something with these basic skills that we've learned so far. So we're going to make another REPL, call it quiz game, because what we're going to be creating is a game that asks you questions you can then answer, and then the app is going to tell you whether you're right or wrong. Just with the basics, you can do quite a lot. First thing we're going to do is create 2 lists. We're going to create one list for questions of our quiz game and another list for the answers. So the answers to the question. We'll create a variable called question. So we're going to remember our bracket. The questions have to be strings. So remember text is strings. And what do we need to do with strings? Quotation marks. So the first question, for example, should you subscribe? Obvious answer to that one is coding cool, question mark. And we need to remember the quotation marks, which even I forget sometimes, which always leads to some errors. And then what we're going to do is create a second list for the answers. So we're going to create a variable called answers. We're going to do these as strings. We could also use Boolean values if you wanted to. Then we want to be able to track our score, so how many questions we've got right so far. So for now, we're going to initialize a variable called score and set it to 0. So you remember how in Python I told you how there's functions like print, and I promised you that we'll be learning how to define our own functions. So we're going to be doing that now. The way you define a function in Python is using first a keyword called def. It stands for define. But whenever you want to define your own function, you write def, and then whatever name you want to give to your function. So for us, we're going to create a function called quiz game, for example. You can call it anything you want. And the third thing we need to do when creating a function is we need to put parentheses at the end of the function. And then the fourth thing, the last thing, is a semicolon. Okay, so the editing me just realized that what I'm talking about here is not actually a semicolon. I think it's a colon. Semicolon is something completely different. So yeah, don't put a semicolon. Apologies. Back to the video. And then you're going to click enter, and you can start defining the body of that function, what that function actually does. And then once we run this function, whatever we write after this def function name, parentheses, semicolon, is what's actually going to be run. So essentially functions allow you to save a block of code into this one package sort of thing. So just as a test, let's say we write print and function works. So now whenever you run this function, it's going to run this line. The way you run a function in Python is pretty much the same thing as defining the function, except you don't use the def keyword. You just write the function name, quiz game, parentheses, and you don't write the semicolon. You just write the function name with parentheses. And now when we run this program, this function is hopefully going to run. Let's see if that happens. As you can see, the function works. Let's say we want to print our questions right here. So we're going to the name of our variable inside the print function as well. And now it's going to print the questions list. Let's see if that works. And it works. As you can see, it prints the array of our questions. So functions are a really excellent way for you to package multiple lines of code into one block of code. So let's say you want to print all of these things at once in multiple parts of your program. You don't need to write all of these multiple times. Instead, you can just write them inside one function, which you can then just run. And this is a really important best practice in Python and in programming in general, is sort of encapsulating your code into these blocks of code, which when your program gets really complicated, is going to make it a lot easier to write and a lot easier to understand. But obviously this is not actually what we want to do with our function, so we're going to erase that. What we're instead going to do inside our function is something called a for loop. So for loops are an example of control flow in programming, and this is where you're really going to be able to do some really cool things. So let's say you want to print a number from 0 to 5. What you can do is, instead of writing them print 0 then 1 etc etc, you can actually do this in just 2 lines of code. If you write for I in range 5 semicolon print I, let's just see what this is going to do. It's going to write a number from 0 to 4, because indexing again starts from 0. 5 numbers starting from 0 with just these 2 lines of code. This is really powerful. You can even do this for 500. Now it's going to run, print all these numbers, and all you have to do is write 1 line of code. This is really powerful. This range, and what you put inside of here, defines how many times this loop has to run. Each iteration, we're going to have this I variable that's going to represent a different number. So what's going to happen in the first run, I is going to be 0, and whatever we do with I is going to be 0, and in the second run it's going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, etc etc. So let's say we want to print each of our questions right here in this questions array. We want to run this loop 1 2 3 4 times, right? So instead of printing I, we want to print an item from the questions array using this I as the index. We're going to print the questions lists index 0, so this first question, and in the second one we want to print this question, so index 1 of the questions. If you can figure out how to do this already, give it a try, and now I'm going to show you how to do it. You're going to write questions bracket I. Remember, this is how we access items from lists in Python. So now what's going to happen is going to run this 4 times. First, it's going to print questions 0, then questions 1, then questions 2, etc. And I just saw that I forgot the print statement, so that's why it didn't work. And there we go. Now it's printing all the questions in order. So this is how we can access all the questions in order from a questions list. But that's actually a better way to do this, because let's say we increase the length of this area. Let's say we add another question. Again, obviously, yes. By the way, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like on the video right now. Let's say we increase the length of the list like this. Now we should run this 5 times instead of 4. We can actually access the length of the list by using this len built-in function. We're going to go len and then questions. We're going to take out the length of this questions list. And now every time we run this, whatever the length of the questions list is, that is how many times it's going to run this loop. Let's see what happens. And as you can see, it takes in the last question as well. For each item of this questions list, we want to first of all print the question, and then we want to also take as input, so allow the user to input an answer. And the way you do this in Python is using this input built-in function. And then inside of here, we're going to type please answer, for example. So now what it's going to do is, instead of running the loop 5 times, it's going to ask for an answer from the user. So I can type whatever I want here, and then after that it's going to keep running. Actually, one way to make this better, as you can see, we were sort of writing an answer right after this please answer text, which is probably not what we want. We want to print a new line to make it a bit better to look at. So the way you print a new line in Python is using /n. And /n, which means print a new line in Python. Instead of asking to write an answer right here, it's actually going to go below, so it's going to be easier to see, essentially. This is a minor upgrade. We're going to get the answer from the user, and we're actually going to want to save that answer inside a variable. So we're going to define a variable called ans, for example, and then set it to equal the input from the user. So whatever the user inputs as the answer is going to be saved in this variable. And then we want to check whether this answer is equal to the answer that we want. And the way we do that is using something called an if statement in Python. The way this works is you write if, which is a keyword in Python, ans equals, and here when we are comparing 2 things, we're actually going to write 2 equal signs, because if we were writing run, Python would be thinking that we want to assign something to the ans variable, which is not what we're going to do. We want to compare 2 things, so we're going to do 2 equal signs. So now we want to access the answer that we want to compare it to, which is going to be the answers list index I. So the same index as the current iteration of the questions list. We want to access the answers from that list. So then we're going to write a semicolon. And then the way if statement works is another example of this control flow in Python. So whatever we now write here is going to only run if this condition is true. So if answer equals to the correct answer, then this thing is going to run. If it doesn't equal it, it's not going to run. It's basically going to skip. So if you're correct, we're going to print correct, for example. And if you're wrong, now we're going to take out the indentation so that now whatever code we write next is not part of the if statement anymore. We want to do is so that if the answer is correct, we print correct, and else, so if the answer is not correct, we do something else. So in Python, the way you do this is simply writing the else keyword. Whatever we write here is going to be run if this thing is not true. And if you're not correct, we're going to print incorrect, you fool. So okay, so it's going to ask us a question. Should you subscribe? Yes, of course. Correct. Yes. Now, is coding cool? Let's say we answer wrong and we say no. It's going to say incorrect, you fool, because we were wrong. So it seems to work. Now, the last thing we want to do here is remember that we wanted to keep track of our score. So if our answer is correct, we want to increment this variable from 0 to first to 1. The way you do this in Python, we're going to score. We're going to reassign it. So score is equal to whatever the score is currently plus 1. There's actually even a shorter way to write this same line in Python. The way you do that is to plus equal to 1. Basically just means the same thing. It's just a shorter way of writing the same thing, which is essentially just mean increase the variable by 1. And actually it's giving us an error. So actually what we're gonna have to do is take the score and put it inside the function, I think, so that we can actually access it and modify it. And if you're incorrect, we don't want to do anything. So after all of these rounds have run, we want to print our scores. How many answers we go correct? So we're going to print score like that. See, okay, so yes, yes, it's cool. Yes, so that's going to be wrong. And is Java a fun language? No. Correct again. Should you like the video? Let's say I'm a fool and I don't think we should like the video, which we obviously should, by the way. We write no and we're incorrect, and at the end we got 3 of our 5 questions right. Obviously we can do a lot of things to make it better, to optimize it, but essentially just with these very basic concepts of Python, we were able to write a very nice game, essentially like a real functioning working program, which is pretty cool. One more thing I'm gonna do here is show you how to use something called f strings. So for the user, it's probably better if he actually shows what this 3 at the end actually means. So for example, we might imagine printing at the end final score is score, but as you'll see, this doesn't actually work. We're like yes, yes, again, it doesn't actually work because this score is inside a string, so it's literally going to write score instead of taking the score variable. So the way you get around this is using something called f strings in Python. You write f at the beginning here, and we're going to put this score inside curly braces. So this is actually essentially telling Python that we don't literally want to type score. We're going to access the score variable and print whatever the value of that variable is. So let's see how this works now. There we go. Prints final score 3, and whatever your score is, it's going to print it. I know this is not even the optimal way to do this. If you know how something called dictionaries work in Python, you could actually make these questions and answer all as part of one variable. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're not going to go there. Essentially, the purpose of this video was just to show the absolute basics, and hopefully now you have some sort of an idea of how the Python language works. But certainly, this is obviously not enough for you to be a good Python programmer, not enough for you to get a job. So if you want to learn more about Python, there's a couple of resources that I would recommend. If you want a free option, there's an excellent course on Coursera that you can order for free, which is called Python for Everybody. It's one of the most popular Python courses online, and it was personally the first ever programming course I did myself, so that's why it has a really soft spot in my heart. It starts from 0 and it goes into sort of maybe mid-intermediate level, or maybe lower intermediate. If you really want to go advanced and you want to learn even more, you are going to have to still do some more things to really become proficient in Python. So that's probably the other resource I recommend if you are willing to spend some money, is the Python online bootcamp from zero to mastery, which is probably the most complete Python course online that I've found, and I'm actually still doing it myself because it starts from 0 and it goes all the way to the most advanced features that you might think about learning Python. So the most complete Python course that I found myself. So even for me, there's still a lot to learn about Python in this course. It's a monthly or annual subscription that doesn't just get you access to this Python course, it gets you access to the whole catalog of like thousands of hours of coding courses. And my camera died again, but as I was saying, Zero to Mastery are amazing and I am their proud affiliate. So if you want 10% off the coding courses, you can check out the link below in the description, and I also have a discount code. Thanks also Replit for sponsoring this video. I highly recommend that you check out that platform to start coding your own projects. I usually don't do tutorials like this on this channel, so if you want to see more, let me know in the comments if this is something that you want to see more of, and like the video so that you can indicate to me that you actually enjoy videos like this. If you do want to see more Python tutorials from me right now, I actually did make one previous to this, which is for an automation project, which is a lot more challenging than this one. But perhaps if this video was too easy for you, you can check out this video next to see if it's more to your liking.